Hello and welcome to another episode of Spartalk, the podcast of the Spartacist League, where we bring you our perspectives on world politics and the task of communists. So it only occurred to me after the first episode that I completely failed to introduce myself. That's a rookie mistake. But my name is Mansa and I'll be your host. I'm a member of the editorial board of Spartacist, the theoretical journal of the Spartacist League, and I'm also the editor of Women in Revolution. Today's episode is called Transliberation, Liberal Betrayals, Marxist Answers. This is the title of the lead article of Women in Revolution. Its purpose is to provide, as the title indicates, some Marxist answers for the trans movement. Why is it at such an impasse? Why is it at the front line of the right-wing attacks? And what is the task of communists regarding transliberation? With me to discuss the article is the author, Comrade Perrault. Welcome to Spartalk, Comrade.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So I was wondering if you could just start by giving our listeners an overview of this article.
Okay. I think there's really three main points in this article where we really break new ground. The first is we try to explain why there's this offensive against trans people today. It's very clear that this offensive is taking place and very palpable, but not a lot of people can explain why it's taking place. The second key point that this article makes is it gives a Marxist answer to the trans question, or at least it tries to do so in a serious way. Most Marxists either will echo a lot of what the liberals say and will add to that some Marxist phraseology, or a lot of them will have quite reactionary positions on the Marxist, on the transgender question. So we try to cut through both those poles and offer a real answer. Finally, we try to do what nobody really is able to do right now, and is to actually propose a road forward for advancing transgender liberation in the current context of heightened reaction.
Okay, great. So I was hoping that in this episode, you would just walk us through the different sections of the article. But I'd like to start our discussion by first asking you to talk a little bit about the first part. And for our readers, our listeners who haven't read this or don't have this in front of them, part one is called Gradualism and the Tides of History. And in this section, you talk about essentially US imperialism, right? From a period, post-war liberalism and so on to current decline of US hegemony. And my question to you is, why do you start with US imperialism? Because to me, initially, it appeared incredibly counterintuitive because here we are talking about sexuality. So what does US imperialism have to do with the trans question?
So the point of this first section of the article is really to expose the illusions in gradualism, in the view that slowly, step by step, things will improve for trans people and for other sexually oppressed groups. But to really take this illusion on, we have to be able to explain why it was possible over the last few decades to make a lot of progress on questions of sexuality, especially in the West, to be able to explain why this is no longer the case now. And you can't explain this just by looking at the gay question or lesbian question or the trans question in isolation. We really have to put this in relation to what's going on more broadly in society.
Okay. That sounds quite useful. Now, actually, only reading this, it occurred to me that, the introduction of gay marriage in the West is quite a recent phenomenon. So you talk here about, it was only following the 2008 financial crisis when Obama was president that same-sex marriage was legalized. And then you go on to talk about a paradox. And I want you to try and explain this paradox to our listeners. So you say, it's only because of the literal bankruptcy of the liberal world order that the capitalist class could advance as far as it did toward sexual liberalization. What are you getting at here?
Right. I think to properly answer that question, I need to take a few steps back.
Okay.
And we need to start first with looking at the post-World War II era.
Mm-hmm.
At that time, the US had just won the Second World War and was really gearing up for the Cold War. Mm-hmm. And it's in this process of gearing up for the Cold War that the US really tightened the noose on questions of special oppression in the United States itself. There was a whole period of witch hunt and anti-gay hysteria, but these were really reflections of the need of the US ruling class to really clamp down on internal dissent. And the question of sexuality is always a very effective tool for the ruling class to bring social conformity and order.
Right.
Now, if we look at what happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the US did not have any big rivals in the world. And so it served its interest to cover its rule over the world really in these grand universal principles of liberty, democracy, and so on. But as you said, in the first years of the post-Soviet period, there wasn't big steps that were made in terms of legalizing same-sex marriage. When did these really start kicking in more strongly in the West? It's really when the ruling class in the West couldn't really afford to make any real reforms or really improve the conditions of most people. And so it really more and more leaned towards making concessions on things that would not cost a lot of money, but could really keep the illusion going that they were really advancing the cause of social progress. So that explains that sentence.
I see. Okay, so I guess coming more to the current period, which is the decline of US hegemony and, the return of Trump. I mean, you began by talking about the palpable, reaction against the trans movement. But you say here explicitly, of course, today, whether it's on the left or the mainstream sort of political commentary, everybody has some sort of a criticism to make about liberalism. But here you actually make this quite an important point. And you say the trans issue wasn't just American liberalism's next frontier, but really its last frontier. That is to say that the trans question is the farthest liberals could push sexual liberalization before hitting a wall. Now, again, I think to really get to the heart of some of the, illusions and gradual progress and so on, what does it mean to call the trans question the last frontier of American liberalism?
So there's a few elements to this. One is that the trans question really symbolizes the limits of how far you can go in terms of liberal reforms and capitalism, in terms of really bringing sexual liberation. There's material constraints in capitalism, the main one being the institution of the family, which we'll get into a little later. But then the second thing is the trans question really embodies the weakness of the liberal order in the world. Really, it's the last question, if you want, that the liberals could really push when slowly they were feeling the power eroding from under their feet. And so if the trans question is such a flashpoint, it's really because it represents in some way the frontier between the declining liberal order and the emerging order of reaction, who really senses the weakness of the liberal wing of the ruling class and is really trying to use the trans question as a wedge issue, push forward a further backlash. And because the trans issue is a touchy issue for a lot of the liberals, it's also the first question on which they're willing to totally capitulate to the right wing. That and immigration is obviously another big question.
Right. And I think talking about backlash now, of course, the central purpose of our work, our propaganda, our discussions is to try and advance the interests of the working class. A key part of that is to unite the working class. Now, speaking of backlash, part of the backlash against liberalism, of course, expresses itself in the working class, right? There is a tremendous kind of hatred for the existing status quo amongst huge layers of the working class. And part of that does express itself on the trans question. So could you talk a little bit about how this kind of turn towards reaction is expressing itself within the working class?
I think you already said many of the key elements. For a lot of working people, the trans question cannot be really separated from liberalism. And so for years they've been hearing the preaching from the liberal in the ruling class that, they were backward and so on. And meanwhile, their living conditions got worse and worse. And a lot of people associate, pushing the trans issue as, reflecting the liberal status quo. Now, of course, this is wrong. And actually, the working class has an interest in fighting for trans people.
Of course.
But to really be able to make this argument and this case effectively, as we tried to do through this article, we have to understand this kind of mixing up of questions and be able to show how the trans question, advancing it, is not co-equal to defending the liberal status quo. And that's how you can actually win workers to defending trans people.
Right, absolutely. And I think this is precisely where the left completely fails, because they totally imbibe in the whole liberalism on social questions. Okay, so thanks for helping us to understand why actually, in order to understand that you're not going to have, onwards and upwards progress for the trans question, why you need to actually put it in the context of US imperialism and its decline. Now I want to transition to part 2. And this is kind of the longest part, and I can see why, because it's about untangling gender. It's got many sections that try and pick up on different elements of the debate on gender. So I thought, again, you start in a way that's not quite the norm in debates about gender. So I want you to start by talking a little bit about how you actually pose a question about what's the conflict behind the gender wars.
Yeah, so in most, very often when you read the articles about the trans question, it starts with, there's a lot of definitions. So what we decide to do here is to actually start by posing the political questions first. What are the interests that are behind these various definitions and concepts and so on? And so what do trans people want? What does the trans movement want? So basically what they want is the ability to socially transition from one gender to another, and for that to be socially acceptable. That's basically the broad aim of the trans movement. And so all the definitions, the concept, all flow from this aim. When it comes to the anti-trans movement, there's all kinds of different ways that gets expressed. There's the TERFs, there's some that use Marxist verbiage, there's, of course, the church, and then there's all kinds of reactionaries. But what they all share in common is that they don't want socially transitioning into a different gender to be acceptable socially. At least they want to try to limit that. Then finally, I deal with what we as communists, how do we pose this question? So our ultimate goal is the liberation of the working class and the end of all oppressions, including gender oppression. And so in that sense, our aims overlap with the aims of the trans movement. However, where we have a difference is how to achieve this in terms of both the method and the program.
Right. Okay. So how about we just then start talking a little bit about of course, this is an article written from the standpoint of Marxism. And why don't we start by putting the whole question in a little bit of, materialist philosophical footing, I suppose, because the second section you have here is the question of biology and society. So what was the aim here? What were you trying to deal with here?
So the kind of main argument that the reactionaries use is basically a woman is a woman. A woman is a biologically fixed entity, and you cannot, debate this in any way. And so there's truth, that there are obviously fundamental biological differences between men and women. But they use this fact to kind of present the social aspects of womanhood as totally secondary.
Right.
When you think of it, defining a woman as producers of large gametes or something like that.
Right.
It doesn't tell you much about what does it mean socially to be a woman.
Right.
And so they try to just put things into this really rigid box that really divorces biology from social relations. But in fact, if you look at human evolution itself, you have constant interactions between biological change and social relations. Those things are not separate.
Right. Actually, I'm looking at the spread of the article here, and I thought it was a really funny spread. You've got a picture of Taylor Swift, a woman working in a factory, and it seems like a, hunter-gatherer woman from some tribal society, it seems. And the caption is 3 human females, which is to kind of reinforce the point about what is a woman, right? It depends according to the social conception of what that is. And I guess there's this tension always of biology versus the social aspect of things. And based on my own kind of familiarity and reading of these debates, the reactionaries will always only emphasize the biological side, and to counter that, the LGBTQ plus movement, they'll only emphasize the social side of it. But I think the actual contribution of Marxism in this has to be to actually understand their dialectical interplay.
Yeah. And here, if we look at how the trans movement reacts to this kind of very rigid view of biology with these neat boxes, is they emphasize that no, the biological gender is on a spectrum. Right. So in particular, they point to, the great degree of variation that exists within the female or male biological categories, and also the specific cases of intersex people that you can't really fit in either category.
Yeah.
So, okay, this is true, of course. There is a spectrum.
Right.
But the point that they miss, it's not because there's a spectrum that you don't have qualitative differences between male and female. So basically, in almost everything in nature, you have a combination of spectrum and dichotomies. But the problem really with the trans movement is they tend to use this fact, the fact that there exists somewhat of a spectrum, to deny that there is actually a very hard dichotomy between male biology and female biology.
Right. If I can ask you to speak a little bit about some of the specific attempts from within the trans movement to deal with this question. For example, you have here a quote from a trans academic, Jack Halberstam, I think, who seems to basically say that the whole problem is scientific categorization, which to me seems to be really missing the whole point as to like, why do we have this entire chasm between, on the one hand, the pro-trans and the anti-trans? Like, you know, what, I guess, okay, what's my question? My question is, what's wrong with this attempt here to then lay the blame at the attempt of categorization?
Yeah, I think that example is just a little bit an absurd, example of like blaming science itself, basically, and having categories as the problem. But that's not the problem. Trans oppression does not come from the fact that there exists categories.
Right.
And the problem with this is that if you see everything as a spectrum, everything as subjective, everything as relative, you can't actually change reality. You have to actually understand reality in an objective way to be able to change it.
Right.
So it's not, and so here on one side you have the reactionaries that see everything in like fixed boxes. Things cannot change. Gender cannot change, nor should it. And then you have on the other side, the more liberal idealist view, which is everything can change. Kind of, there's no real like fundamental differences between men and women and so on. And so where Marxism really comes and can kind of overcome this kind of dichotomy between these two things is by both understanding that there does exist defined categories, but there's also contradictions and movement within these categories.
I guess that leads us, because I feel like what you've just said in the last minute or so is the whole question of social relations, right? Like that we as beings exist in definite social relations, right? And that material basis is what gives rise to categories, and like that's the ultimate reality that we have to try and seek to change, right? Yeah. So this takes us to the whole question of like, how does gender play out in capitalist social relations?
Yeah, because actually the whole debate about biology, it's really not the point. That's really not the problem. But trans people are not oppressed because of biology. That's not what and women are not oppressed per se because of biology either. It's really the social relations that are the source of this oppression.
Right. That the fact that women, as a result of their biology, are then expected to play this kind of a role. Is that what you mean?
What I'm saying is that there's nothing with the physical attributes of women that condemn them to be oppressed in society. It's because of the way society is organized.
Right.
And that's where, if we go to, talk here about Engels' book on the origins of the family, private property, and the state, what he explains in this book is really basically the historical roots of women's oppression, that it came with the development of the monogamous patriarchal family. And that this is really a historically evolved process.
Okay. Do you want to maybe keep going?
So bringing this back to today, capitalist society is organized around the institution of the family, even though it's been kind of undermined in all kinds of different ways, with women actually getting into the workforce and being more financially independent, the power of the church being kind of brought down somewhat. Even though, it's been undermined to a large extent, it's still the fundamental social organization that really defines all social relations in capitalism. And so you can't just wish this institution away. You have to overcome it. You have to build a different social institution that will enable the replacing of these social functions.
Okay. I guess let's get into some of the more controversial stuff now.
Right, it's not been controversial so far.
Well, I was thinking when you were saying, it's not the women's biology that makes you're going to get some hate for that. But I think what I mean by more controversial stuff is, especially here in Britain, you know, you got J.K. Rowling and stuff. Let's talk about TERFs.
Right.
You've got this section about why do TERFs exist. And TERFs, for those of you who don't know, it's trans exclusionary radical feminists. So these are radical feminists who think, you know, a woman is a woman, right? So I guess, okay, why do TERFs exist? You think, you know, feminism, like nice little ideology. What's up with this?
Well, the short answer is that in the society as it actually exists today, where there's real like material constraints on the working class and on women and so on, there does exist a certain tension between the rights of women and the rights of trans people. But I want to be clear, this is in society as it exists today,
right?
Because there's a real competition in resources.
So I think, could I just pause? So maybe could you give us like an example of what that conflict is? Like, how does that play out?
A clear example is the women's shelters. So there's not lots of places in women's shelters to start with. And then, you know, women that have been through traumatic experiences of domestic violence or something like that, you know, they kind of understandably sometimes can have reactions at seeing a trans woman in one of these shelters.
Right.
Now, it's not to justify to say that that's a that's a legitimate feeling or something, but you have to kind of understand that that's how society's organized. And you get these tensions everywhere, like when it comes to sports, when it comes to bathrooms even.
Bathrooms, yeah.
So you have, with the conflict, it's really social norms running against kind of the limitations of what's material resources under capitalism.
So if only there were enough bathrooms or enough shelters.
Well, I don't know about the bathrooms example, that works so much, but like sports, you know, like sports is all about being the first, you know, and that brings money. That means there's all kinds of resources that depend on how good your performance
make or break
is,
your career, right?
Exactly. And so you have this already kind of competition for scarce resources. And then on top of that, you add a social complication by introducing, you know, trans people into sports. Now, we have a whole article on that. So I won't get into it so much here, but it's an example of where these tensions exist.
Right. So coming back to TERFs and why they exist, I guess it's because they're able to pick up on kind of this fear, not justified, but fear on part of some women, some segments of women. Okay. But then this really becomes this whole reactionary, divisive thing that's actually really poisoned the feminist movement as of late. So I guess you spent some time here dealing with the arguments of prominent TERF professor Kathleen Stock. Maybe you can take us through like exactly what it is like, because how is it the TERFs construct their arguments, and why is that actually a completely reactionary standpoint?
Yeah. Well, first, if we take a step back a little, like the main spearhead, especially in Britain, of the anti-trans movement hasn't been like the traditional really conservative views against, you know, any kind of gay relationships or like, you know, that's not been the most effective arguments. It's really been this kind of feminist, almost sometimes with a kind of progressive veneer, you know, argument against trans people. And really what makes their arguments effective and very insidious is that they really, you know, lean on the realities of women's oppression.
Right.
You know, and they really try to kind of exacerbate this conflict between trans people and women by leaning on the fact that women are oppressed and everything that comes from that.
So I'm looking here at the article, and you take up, for example, the Socialist Workers' Party in Britain. It's a left group. And I guess I want to talk a little bit about how the left deals with TERFs, because I think, again, if we just step back for a second, you know, that what you started the whole podcast with is the inability of the Marxist movement to be able to really deal with the problems and, confronting the trans movement and actually put forward some answers. So here I think it's indicative. The SWP, you say here, dismisses out of hand the argument made by TERFs. And in their pamphlet, Beyond Binaries from July 2024, they write that, quote, the right and some socialists and feminists who gave the TERFs some cover have based opposition to the Gender Recognition Act reform on the lie that trans women are a threat to women's rights. What exactly are you getting at here in terms of the SWP's approach?
Right. Well, you know, obviously in a general sense, there's no conflict between transgender liberation and women's liberation. Yeah. Those two things can absolutely not be separated. But by just saying that it's a lie, you know, that there's any kind of conflict. It denies that in society as it exists today, with limited material resources, there is a tension. And if you just deny that there's a tension, you can't overcome these conflicts. You can't really offer a road that can overcome these conflicts. It just becomes there's the good guys and there's the bad guys on the other side. Now, of course, we can't put on the same foot, TERFs and trans activists. One are actually fighting to better the conditions, and one are actually fighting to, reinforce the oppression of trans people. But if you want to be able to defeat the TERFs and really kind of win back kind of progressive women that are kind of going in that direction, you have to understand where they're coming from if you really want to win them over.
Right. You go on to talk about the fact that part of the problem is that both TERFs as well as LGBTQ plus activists view the world through a feminist lens, So these are, of course, the divisions in the feminist movement have been, forever old, but it is true that oftentimes LGBTQ plus movement and its proponents and faces and whatever, they're feminists, however radical they want to, claim themselves to be. But that how do you have, I guess, opposing perspectives from within the same broad movement? Like, I guess my question is, what's the problem here?
Right. Some of the problems we get here between the tensions between the TERFs and the pro-trans movement is that both approach the questions in really idealistic terms. So, what makes you oppressed or not is based on these categories or these ideas in people's heads and not really on social institutions. And so when these kind of symbolic questions really become the main questions, it really becomes like a very heated very quickly. To not agree on what is a woman is like the main question, rather than how do you advance the condition of women, the condition of trans people, where if you pose the question that way, there's much more of a possibility of common struggle.
Right. In fact, you'll see that it's actually impossible to divorce the two if you put it on a whole material footing of how to actually improve conditions for both groups. Right. So you've already alluded a little bit to the problem with feminism being liberal idealism.
Yeah.
So let's get right to it. If I'm honest, I just, I didn't really think I would see Judith Butler in the pages of one of our publications, but here we go. So you talk here about Judith Butler, who's really the main figurehead of the postmodern feminist movement. But what's the problem broadly with liberal idealism, and why is it completely bankrupt a philosophical and political outlook for dealing with the question of special oppression?
Well, you really can't go around Judith Butler's contributions when discussing the trans question. And actually, I think a lot of people have actually commented that the hardest part to understand in the article is this quote by Judith Butler.
Right.
So I don't think we need to read this out, but basically, really just if we look at really the fundamental problem with how Judith Butler sees things, is that she does not think that women's oppression is fundamentally derived from any social institution. So she does not think that women's oppression comes from the institution of the family.
Where does she see it as coming from?
I think, if I understand correctly, which, maybe I don't, it's, there's all kinds of different factors, that interact with each other and everything. But the problem with when you view it like that is that, well, what then do you do to fight women's oppression?
Right.
And so since it's not linked to any kind of social organization of, things, it's all about transgressing social norms. So it doesn't become changing society, but it becomes about changing norms.
I read a little bit of Judith Butler back when I was in university, and from what I remember, I guess if you were to summarize it maybe in not the best way, is you have to it's all performance, right? Your gender is your performance. So then I guess the political implication is, well, only if you start performing differently, then you overcome gender oppression. Is that too much of a crude summary, or would you say that kind of...
I don't think I can quite... I'm not the authority to really understand Judith Butler.
Fair enough. I guess... No, I think we can leave Judith Butler there. But I guess to just come back to it, put it a bit succinctly, maybe just outside of Judith Butler. But what is the problem with liberal idealism? Is it that it sees the whole fight in the realm of ideas?
Yeah, that's it.
Right.
And you can't change society that way. That's the basic problem. So, but not only you can't change society, but if your goal is to change social norms without changing the like reality that causes these norms. You're just fighting the symptom and not the disease. And actually, by doing that, you actually exacerbate. So you also create the conditions for a backlash. And that's what we're seeing now.
The whole kind of backlash against woke stuff.
Exactly.
So then, I guess, speaking of those who, at least in words, do talk about changing the world, i.e. are Marxists, you have a section here about the pro-trans, but you put them in quotes, pro-trans Marxists.
Yeah.
So I guess we're getting closer and closer to Marxism and like what Marxists have had to say about this and what the problems with that has been. So could you maybe like start by giving us a little bit of a summary, like what has a Marxist movement been able to say on the question?
Yeah. Honestly, not much that's very good. I've not found much that was very serious in terms of Marxist takes on the trans question.
Okay.
Overwhelmingly, so you have a whole part, especially in the Stalinist groups, that just didn't like reject trans liberation entirely. Basically, they present it as like bourgeois.
Right. Actually, if I can actually stop you there, because I thought you had a hilarious line in the intro of your article, because you say here, many self-proclaimed Marxists openly embrace reactionary anti-trans positions using analytical methods closer to those of the Catholic Church than to any serious Marxist theoretician. And I think, especially in Britain, I think like, I don't know if it's most of the CPs, but the Stalinists definitely do a disservice to the just Marxism.
They make it a caricature, they use the materialistic view of Marxism to present it as like a rigid, unchanging categories, which is just really a caricature. But then you have a lot that kind of ignore the question, like try finding something serious about the trans question with the Grantite tradition, good luck. And honestly, ourselves, like we've not done the greatest job in this question at all in the last years.
I think this is, we're late to the question, and whatever, that's life. But I think, if I do survey the left, my understanding is that you'll have, either the shitty reactionary positions or you'll have like total tailing, like, oh, okay, like trans liberation, without really taking up like, okay, well, why is it not really working? What's the obstacles and so on and so forth? So it's just kind of empty cheering on and solidarity. So, yes, okay, of course we're late, but I do think this actually, our contribution seeks to really deal with like what have been the political problems and how can we actually take stock and move forward. So anyways, all of that to come back to our pro-trans Marxists. Right.
So the problem with them is that it can be sometimes quite confusing. So they can, for example, write against idealism in general. But then when it comes to some of the concrete questions, they totally echo all the liberal kind of sacred cows of the trans movement.
Give us an example.
So one example, again, we write here about the SWP. It both how they try to define what gender is, and so they give both a social definition and at the same time a totally subjective definition that it depends, that your gender really depends on your feeling inside you. Right. That's totally independent from social relations. So what we try to explain then in this section is that gender does not exist in a vacuum. Gender is a social relation. And so one kind of clear expression of this is that your will to transition does not mean that you'll be socially accepted as such. And that's not to say that people shouldn't or any, that's just how society is right now. Right. And that's really the source of trans oppression, actually. They are oppressed because their gender they would like to live in is not, society makes it difficult and sometimes impossible almost for that to be socially accepted. But you have to understand that just as much as biological categories, gender categories are real. They're socially rooted in institutions.
Right. You've got here somebody named Roxy Hall. I'm actually not familiar with the work of Roxy Hall, but she's written 10 theses on the gender question, revisited. Could you maybe tell us a little bit? Okay, so we've talked about the SWP a little bit. This is slightly different. So what's the problem with Roxy Hall? What's she trying to say?
Fundamentally, it's the same type of problem. So she writes that a way to abolish gender is to live in unconventional ways, which again just goes back to what we've already discussed, is that you don't change societies by changing attitudes or changing conventions, by changing a material reality. And actually, if you push against challenge social conventions independently from actually trying to change like social relations, you're just going to foster a backlash. Then another point that both Roxy Hall and Des WP share, and it really is like you see really everywhere, is that gender is assigned at birth. So that's a very common view.
Yes, yeah.
But again here, what this denies is that gender, it's not actually so fundamentally different from other categories like class, like nationality, like race even. So it's not, your nationality or your race or your gender, these are all like social categories.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that they're arbitrary. It's not just some arbitrary decision that decides, are you a boy or a girl when you're a baby? You're born into specific social relations. And it's just like you're born into a specific class. That doesn't mean that that category is fixed, that you can't do anything to change it. But you have to understand that this is a real social category rooted in how society is organized right now.
Right. I've got two questions coming from there. One, it's a little bit going before to Roxy Hall. I guess this is more, I know the answer to this, but it's more for our listeners. It's just a point of clarification, which is, we're not necessarily against transgressing social norms.
Of course not.
But I think that there's a difference. Like, of course, like we are actually for people living however they want to and choose to live, including how you dress and so on and so forth, I think. But I think the point is you shouldn't have illusions that that's going to be the strategy to abolish gender.
Exactly.
Right.
It's as a mode of political action.
Exactly. So that's one point. And I think the other, again, I'm looking at the article here. You've got a graphic here of Rachel Dolezal.
Yes, speaking of controversial.
Exactly. And I know, again, from comrades who read this, especially like younger comrades who aren't so familiar with the case, could you maybe speak a little bit to this case and why is this relevant to our discussion of the trans question?
This is a very controversial case in the United States of a woman that was born white, but then lived a large part of her life as black, and then even became a leader in the NAACP. And when it came to light that she was born white, this provoked a whole scandal, and all the liberals really denounced her for doing this, right? And so the right wing often refers to this example to kind of bait trans people. Can you change your race? You can change your gender. Can you also change your race? And the liberals immediately become very defensive, and then they find all kinds of convoluted arguments for why you absolutely cannot compare race to gender. But what's if somebody wants to be socialized in a different race, what's the problem with that?
It actually undermines their own argument that these are social things.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
Because both are.
Right. Interesting. So, right, that was my second question. So, all right, so here we are kind of at the end of our section on untangling gender. Now, we've talked about, I think, quite a range of things. How would you sum up? How would you sum up the problem of gender? Or I don't know. I'll give you free reins on this question.
Well, let me set up what why we're spending all this time going into these debates. And it's because you really, if you have an idealist view of the trans question, you really can't advance the struggle for trans liberation properly, especially in the current climate where, it was one thing to kind of be pro-trans and liberal in the context where, all these different corporations have these DEI programs. They're all trying to be, LGBTQ plus inclusive and so on, and so you could kind of push that strategy in that kind of climate, and it seemed to be quite effective, shaming people and so on, for their backward views.
Right.
But in a context where the wind has totally changed, where there's a real heightened reactionary climate and also, a lot of repression, those tools just really won't work at all. And it's really essential that we have a proper understanding of the trans question and how to actually advance its cause to be able to conduct this struggle successfully.
Right. This might be stupid now, but I'm thinking the point really is to win, activists fighting for trans liberation to a Marxist worldview.
Exactly. Right.
Away from this idealist thing to try, to win them to the fight to change society, Okay, so that brings us to part 3, the final part, which is a Marxist program to fight reaction. And here you kind of lay out 8 specific points on which to build a basis for taking forward the movement for trans liberation. Yes? If I can just ask you to start by talking a little bit about Lenin, because you do start with Lenin, specifically an article called Attitude of the Workers' Party to Religion. What's the significance of this?
Well, we actually reprint a large part of that article by Lenin in this issue of Women and Revolution. And I really encourage people to read it. It's really a great article. What Lenin tries to deal with is how do you approach the question of religion as a communist. So of course, as communists, we're against religion as an institution, and we understand that, it's a idealist view of how the world works, and we're for a materialist view of how the world works. But at the same time, our ultimate aim is to advance the class struggle, to advance the emancipation of the working class. And so those ideas, religious ideas, are an obstacle to advancing this cause. But the best way to confront these kind of backward ideas is not to directly attack religious ideas and illusions, but really try to fight for the maximum unity of the working class in the class struggle against capitalism, which is what you need to ultimately eradicate the religious ideas. It's not through just ideological campaigns, but through changing social relations. And in many ways, what Lenin writes here about religion applies to the trans question and all kinds of other questions of where social norms and, backwardness is in question.
Right. Okay. So let's just go point by point through the different points. So number 1, ditch the liberals.
Yeah.
And you got here a picture of Keir Starmer and Sadiq Khan and Angela Rayner holding a big old pride banner.
So the point here is kind of simple, but really an essential one, is that the liberals have really been the main force pushing for the LGBTQ plus cause. But at the same time, as we see right now, they're the first to abandon the whole cause when the situation actually gets difficult.
Right.
And so they're really a fundamentally unreliable ally. And even though the liberals have now pretty clearly shown that they want nothing to do with the trans question right now, and honestly, I don't think it will be too long before they start throwing other, specifically oppressed groups, including gays and lesbians, under the bus. But so despite this, the liberals' clear, change of attitude around this question, a lot of the left and pro-trans movement still looks towards them and still entertains hopes, or if not quite hopes, they still themselves hold on to a lot of these liberal conceptions.
Right, actually it reminds me when we were working on this article, it's Left Voice in the US. They had published this article, I forget the exact title, but it was something along the lines of why have the Democrats abandoned trans people or something like that, which is, Left Voice, if you're on the left, you kind of know them as one of the more orthodox talking groups. But again, it's like you've just had Joe Biden, funding a fucking genocide, and you're publishing this article about, where have they gone about the trans question? It's really criminal.
Basically, the situation right now for trans people is worse because of the Democrats not fighting for them, which, okay, it's true to a certain extent, but it's not, if you're a Marxist, that should not really come as a surprise. The article read almost as a appeal that, as a lament that the Democrats are changing tune on this.
Okay. Number 2, drop empty symbolism.
So the point here is that trans liberation is a material act. It will come from changing social relations, not from just changing ideas. And so to advance this struggle, the key is to really focus on advancing the condition of trans people and the condition of the working class and condition of women, and not just concepts in people's heads and symbols. And so there's, so many debates about and attention given to really tertiary questions like, the colors of the LGBTQ plus flag and so on and so on. So these are not the things that should be focused on if your aim is to actually liberate transgender people. Okay,
that's pretty straightforward. All right, number 3, no concessions to bourgeois morality.
Yeah, this is, I think, quite an important point. And trans people are under so much social pressure already, and attacked by reactionaries in the most vicious ways for being deviant and so on and so on. So there's a lot of pressure on trans people themselves that they should not, they should try to conform actually as much as possible to like bourgeois morality. And for example, I think a question that really expressed this was when there was the caste review in Britain, banning puberty, that led to the banning of puberty blockers for trans kids, which has been done in the United States too. And so the bourgeoisie really used this question of kids and their ability to have puberty blockers or not as really a way to go after the trans movement. You could see that a lot of the response was really on the back foot from like the trans movement, but also a lot of the people that are pro-trans, because it touched the question of children and the question of, can they decide or not for their own future, or should it be up to the parents to decide everything for children? And so if you can see to kind of these types of social norms, you really tie your hands in your own back.
Yeah, I think, again, I think the age question is kind of crazy in Britain, how it's used to kind of just shut up any kind of real thing that challenges the existing status quo. So, okay, that's clear enough. Number 4, look to oppressed religious minorities.
Yeah. And in particular here, we were talking about the Muslims and
right.
in the West. This is a bit of a counterintuitive point because a lot of practicing Muslim people have quite conservative ideas when it comes to social questions. But that's the difference between focusing on ideas in people's heads rather than advancing the struggle in trying to build coalitions. So Muslims are also one of the most victimized sectors of Western societies. And so they're not going to be integrated into this new reactionary status quo, unlike the liberals, who are groveling, and I'm sure a lot of them will manage to still have good careers. But the Muslims are really going to be the extreme target of repression, and we already see this in the whole Palestine movement. And so there's really a basis for an alliance if you concentrate on really what the two groups have in common in terms of interest, fighting for the democratic rights against this kind of really reactionary offensive.
Yeah, I'm really glad you put that point in there because, like you said, it is super counterintuitive, but once you explain it, you really see how it's the logical conclusion, like the oppressed should band together and fight against the common enemy. Right, number 5, forge unity between trans and women's liberation.
Yeah, this is a really key one, and we've already talked about it somewhat. But this is really crucial. It's one of the kind of conflict between the trans movement and the feminist movement has really been one of the most damageable things for the trans movement. And so how do you overcome this? And again, it helps to not start with just the questions of symbol and what are in people's head. But what we advocate in terms of a strategy is to really put forward in all of these different cases the question of increasing the resources for both groups. Because the source of this tension is really this limited amount of resources. And also, of course, the kind of backward consciousness that exists in society as it exists today. But by pushing to increase resources in the various areas of conflict, it doesn't make the conflict disappear, but at least it can minimize the shocks. And ultimately, really, these two questions really have to be tied together because women are also absolutely the target of attacks right now all over the world and will continue to be. And so it will be really crucial in the coming years to really tie the question of advancing the condition for women with advancing the condition for all other sexually oppressed groups in society.
Number 6, the working class is a decisive force.
Yeah, this is obviously a crucial point. Why do we say that the working class is a decisive force to liberate transgender people? And it's not because of the ideas in the working class's head, but really because it has an objective interest in ending capitalism and establishing a society free of all kinds of oppression, including gender oppression. Now, this doesn't mean we don't talk about the transgender question to the working class and we just focus on class issue, which a lot of people call class reductionism, which is a real problem. The point rather is to talk about the transgender question, but linking the transgender issue with the issue of working class emancipation, trying to explain to the working class why it's in its own interest to advance its liberation, to champion the rights of trans people, and how these divisions around sexual lines or racial lines or any other kind of divisions really inhibit its ability to fight and to liberate itself.
If I could just ask you to elaborate on a concrete issue, you talk here a little bit about healthcare as being one example, of how this can actually be motivated.
Yeah. Well, everywhere, as capitalism is really entering a period of crisis and where there's all this talk of rearming and so on, healthcare is one of the high points of tension where really conditions are rapidly plummeting for the entire working class. And so there's a lot of resentment in certain areas of the working class for trans people that get surgeries and so on when they themselves have no access to healthcare. Now, that can be turned around and be turned into a force actually for the movement if we really put forward, a real struggle for, free quality healthcare and integrate the right of trans people to have the medical care they need as part of this broader struggle, to really tie these two struggles together.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Number 7, forget gradualism.
Yes, we already talked about this somewhat, but a key question is really to understand that this period of liberal gradualist reform that characterized the last decades is not coming back. And that really the only way forward for trans people is to fight for revolution. If they want, if we want to achieve transgender liberation, or honestly, really even the most minimal decent living conditions, that's exposed extremely starkly for trans people, and really increasingly for the working class as a whole.
And lastly, build a revolutionary international party.
Yeah, there's really 2 points in this. The first is international, and I think it's important to keep in mind the trans issue, although it's an international one, it's been a question of particular focus politically in the West. But really, there's the question of women's oppression and trans oppression is really an international one. And it's really key to have an international perspective to advance trans liberation. It's also crucial to have a revolutionary party as an instrument to actually fight for a revolution.
Mm-hmm. Okay. But, I think crucially, because, I'm sorry, I'm going to hate myself for this, but the Grantites these days are all for building a revolutionary party, right? But I think what's a whole world of difference between them and us is that you actually need to understand and draw political lessons of past failures, right? In order to then move on. As you say here, to build such a party, we must draw the political lessons of past failures, understand how the liberalism of the past decades has not only led the trans movement astray, but also led the revolutionary left to be more splintered and weaker than ever.
Yeah, it's not enough. Obviously, a revolutionary party is crucial, but it's not enough to just go around and say, we need a revolutionary party, we need a revolutionary party.
Right.
You have to try to explain what policy should the revolutionary party follow on a given question. For example, the trans question. What should the revolutionary party actually do to try to overcome the divisions between women and trans people, Muslims and trans people, the working class and trans people? How do you unite these struggles concretely in the class struggle? That's really the key question for building a revolutionary party.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you put it that way, because I think, obviously, so we're at the end of our article, but I think, this was one of the key aims with this article as well, right? To try and put forward a Marxist perspective for the trans movement, but to actually provoke a debate in the left and in the trans movement about what road forward, right? What's gone wrong? How do we go forward from here? What are the differences? Let's thrash them out. And, that this has been our contribution to provoking such a debate. To that end, we really welcome any and all criticisms and differences and so on and so forth. Please do get in touch with us. You can always reach us at spartacist@spartacist.org or one of our many social media channels. Our main one is on X. Is there anything else that you'd like to end with?
No, I think we've covered all the main points.
Yeah, okay. There is, as you alluded to earlier, we do have 2 accompanying pieces to this. One is on the sports ban in the US. It's called To Hell with the Sports Ban. And then there's a short reprint of an article that we wrote on the CAS review in Britain, and that's called Let Trans Kids Decide. Both of these are available to be read for free online if you just go to iclfi.org. And I think that's it. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you for listening. Until next time.
Thank you.